Hello, everyone, and welcome back to part 2 of this series on Ketubot 62, where we'll be continuing to discuss the long section of Aggada about rabbis and their wives and the tension between their devotion to Torah alongside their devotion to an obligation to their home life. So just to refresh your memories, we're just going to review what happened earlier. To remind you, in the first 4 stories, which we discussed earlier, we have, first of all, the pair of stories about Rav Rechume and Yehuda bar Rabbi Akiva, who both have both left home. Rav Rechume comes back once a year and forgets to come back Erev Yom Kippur because he is engrossed in his Torah learning, and he falls down through the roof as his wife's tears fall down to the ground because he has not come home. And Yehuda bar Rabbi Akiva actually is quite good and comes home every Erev Shabbat, but unfortunately, tragically, misses one and dies. And this is all to reinforce the statement, to be warned that a Torah scholar who goes away for a long time, there's going to be a price to pay. It's wonderful to be so devoted to Torah, but there's a price to pay long term. And that's really what's being expressed in these stories. And we're going to see that come out even more explicitly in the last 3 sections. Then we have stories 3 and 4 of our story cycle. One about Rebbe's son, who is too eager and decides to marry before going off to the Beit Midrash. Then he goes for 12 years. And unfortunately, nobody passes away, but unfortunately, there's an issue of infertility because so much time has passed. And thankfully, the rabbis pray, and the wife is, the nameless anonymous wife, becomes fertile. Rabbi Hanania ben Chachinai is important for today's class because we're going to see that story 5 follows Rabbi Hanania's story, which is that he is so eager for Torah, he comes back after 12 years of learning to see his wife, and he can't recognize his home, he can't recognize his city, he doesn't even know he has a daughter. He figures out at the riverbank that his daughter is there by someone calling her name, daughter of Chachinai, and he goes home, he follows her home, and when his wife sees him, she dies, but he prays and brings her back to life. We've noted that this story cycle is clearly put together and been somewhat edited in a way that ties the stories all together thematically. And so there are similarities that run through certain stories, such as the themes of Erev Yom Kippur, Erev Shabbat, of certain rabbis dying, of women being healed through prayer, even though the damage is still there. And so now we're going to turn to our sources on the screen and continue with stories 5 through 7. Okay, story 5 seems to have knowledge of the previous story, which shows a little bit of the hand of editing, which in the Talmud Bavli we see quite clearly sometimes. So in story number 5, Rabbi Hama bar Bisa has the following story. Again, the numbers are both increasing and starting to repeat themselves. Rabbi Hama bar Bisa azel veyativ. He goes and he sits. Similar language to our previous stories. This really reflects the oral nature of these stories being told and easy to remember when there are repetitive elements. So he goes and sits Trei Shanei for 12 years in the Beit Midrash. Ki ata amar la avid keda avid ben Chachinai. I'm not going to do like the son of Chachinai and go and shock my wife to death. I'll be smart. I'll be thoughtful. Instead, I'll yativ Beit Midrasha shalach lebeitei. He goes and sits in the local Beit Midrash and writes to send a message home that he's coming home so that no one should be shocked. Of course, the glaring question here, if you hopefully have thought about it like me, is if there's a local Beit Midrash, why has he gone away for 12 years from his family? A question which is somehow just laying there, nuance in the text, but not answered. Now, the story continues, the meeting with his wife. And here we have another story where we do hear the voice of the wife, which doesn't happen in all the pieces. And in a way, there's a little bit of rebuke going on. At Rabbi Oshaya brei ativ kameh. So while he was sitting in the Beit Midrash, it turns out a young rabbi comes and sits in front of him, who he does not know is his son. We see that the stories here also, the tellers of the storytellers are using literary elements here, not just keywords and words with double meaning, but also irony. And so his son sits before him. He does not realize it's his son. And they start to have a back and forth of halacha, of discussion in the Beit Midrash. And he sees how bright this young man is, okay? And he says to himself, Chalash date in the second line. He says to himself, he feels a little bit disheartened. Amar maybe I should have stayed home. Then I would have a bright son like this. What an unbelievable self-reflective comment that the rabbi starts to realize there was a price to pay for being away for so long. Now, ironically, he does have a son as bright as this, but he doesn't even know it. And he didn't have the joy of raising this son and seeing the learning over all the years. Al levete, he goes up to his house. Al brei kam kameh hu savar lemishale shmatata. So he goes to his house and his son comes in. And Rabbi Hama doesn't realize yet that his son, but he stands up before this impressive young man, Rabbi Yoshaya, who's already impressed him in the Beit Midrash. His wife, who we now hear for the first time, says to him, Mi'ika, right? Kavai amrale devitayu. His wife says to him, Mi'ika abba dekaim mekamebra. What father stands up to show honor to his own son? The story is just highlighting the irony and the sadness here that he doesn't realize this is his son, and he's even in his own house, and he's standing up before him, and he's a bit clueless. And the wise wife is the one who calls this out, and underlying her words is all of this emotion. So Karei Ale, they apply a pasuk to this situation. The threefold cord is not quickly broken. Luckily, the tradition of Torah scholarship in this family is almost genetic, almost innate, and passed down. Or possibly the mother had a hand in this young man's becoming a great Torah scholar. Another possible interpretation. Rabbi Yoshaya b'no shel Rabbi Hama bar Bisa. He continues the three-part generation devotion to Torah. And so this story has a happier ending. And yet it still highlights so much of what goes wrong when the rabbis go away for so long. Now story 6 is certainly our most positive story. And even here, I think there's still a few pieces of the possibility that it's still critiquing these rabbis. Rabbi Akiva, you'll know this story. You've heard this story, many of you. Rabbi Akiva worked as a shepherd for Kalba Savua. Here we'll hear about his wife, who doesn't have a name in this story. Elsewhere, she's called Rachel. Of course, none of the women in these stories have a name. Also significant. He sees the daughter of Kalba Savua, who is humble and refined, and she says to him, right away we hear her voice, she is the one who suggests he goes and learn Torah. She says, I'll become betrothed to you on the condition that you go study. So he goes, he agrees, and he goes off. But when Kalba Savua hears this, he's terribly angry because Rabbi Akiva is just ignoramus at this point, and he removes his wife from any possibility of having benefit from his property. The story continues. Okay, and again we have our language, Azal Yativ. Okay, Rabbi Akiva goes and sits. How many years? 12 years, of course. The numbers have stabilized at 12 years. But we'll see Rabbi Akiva gets a double run. And after 12 years, he also manages to amass 12,000 students. So perhaps in Rabbi Akiva's case, it's warranted because he was such a great scholar. Sham'elahu Saba, the Kamar. Okay, so he comes back and he brings his 12,000 students with him. When he comes back, he hears an old man saying to his wife, saying to Rachel, how long will you lead the life of a widow of a living man? Meaning she's living poorly, but she has a husband, but he's not there. She says to the old man, and Rabbi Akiva overhears this whole conversation. If it were up to me, he'd go back for another 12 years. Rabbi Akiva hears this and believes this is the reshut. Okay, remember part of the Mishnah was going off with or without permission. Here she's given permission, the signal, although they have not spoken directly, and he goes and sits another 12 years in the Beit Midrash. Next, he comes back, and of course he comes back now with 24,000 students. And his wife hears, again, she's nameless here, Sham'at beitahu hava kanaf galape. And I think there's a significance in the anonymity of the women in these stories because they are the home, and they're all in this similar situation of, you can imagine the financial and emotional strain of what it is to be alone or possibly a single mother for so many years. So his wife hears, and she goes out to greet him. Amrula shivavata. The neighbors say to her, they say, borrow some clothes, dress yourself up for this occasion. And she says something very troubling to me here. Amralehu, she says to them, Yodea tzadik nefesh behimato. A righteous man understands the life of his beast. Okay, not the most complimentary pasuk. Of course, we know that if her name truly is Rachel, then it could be a reference to her name being Rachel, also a name for sheep. And so perhaps there's a reference there to that. But she's saying, I don't need to be wrapped up in materialistic things. When he comes, she falls down on her face and kisses his feet, which is something that will appear in the next section. And the attendants, the students, don't understand that this is his wife. They try to pull her off of him. And he says famously, leave her. Sheli v'shelachem shalahu. What's actually amazing here is the acknowledgement on Rabbi Akiva, almost suddenly like the crossing of boundaries, whereas before there's the house and there's the Beit Midrash, and the rabbis are either in their house or in the Beit Midrash. But here Rabbi Akiva is bringing the Beit Midrash to his house, bringing all the students to that domain, and saying that all the Torah he's amassed is really hers too. And so suddenly there's this inclusivity and possibility of not just bringing the Torah home, but bringing the wife into the Torah as well, which is a slightly more positive view of the whole situation. Okay, finally, Kalba Savua hears, and he goes out, and he nullifies his vow, and he said, had I known that Akiva would become such a great man, I wouldn't have done this, but poor Rachel still had to live poorly for so many years. Of course, the idea that it's really true that it was 24 years is somewhat unlikely. Even if the numbers are exaggerated, they are used here for a literary purpose, but the idea is definitely conveyed that she gave permission, she supported, and he went the furthest of any of the rabbis. Ben Kalba Savua goes out, and he falls on his face and kisses Rabbi Akiva's feet, following, again, Rachel is the leader here. She pushes Rabbi Akiva to learn. Kalba Savua follows the model of his daughter Rachel. Finally, we hear about Rabbi Akiva's daughter in the last section who does the same thing. She marries Ben Azai and caused him to learn in a similar way. And interestingly, the pasuk used here is Rachela batar Rachela azla. The saying, it's not a pasuk. The saying is that the you follows the you. The daughter's actions are the same as the mother's. And this perhaps is a reference to the name Rachel, which is not given explicitly here. But in the context of our 7 stories, the Rabbi Akiva story is certainly the most positive and encouraging of rabbis to leave. And this is the perfect story. If our kovetz would have ended here, then perhaps that would have been the message. Yet there is one more story, a 7th story. 7 is a very important number in the Talmud. It appears a lot in Judaism in general. And so the 7th piece of the story really says explicitly what's been said implicitly through the whole time. We hear about one more rabbi, Rav Yosef, brei de Rava. Rav Yosef, the son of Rava, Shadrei Avoy Levei Rav, his father sent him to the study hall to learn before Rav Yosef. These are all great rabbis. Now, Paskule Sheit Shnei Ki Havatz. Okay, Paskule Sheit Shnei. They made a deal. They agreed that it would be 6 years in the study hall. So it's half the ideal 12. However, after 3 years, Rav Yosef decided it's time to go home and see my wife. So we have some admiration for him in the context of our stories. When was this? Bringing us full circle. Our first story was Erev Yom Kippur. Here we are again, Erev Yom Kippur. Matzah male Yoma de Kippurei. It is Erev Yom Kippur again, and he goes home after 3 years, not 6 years. Okay? Shma Avui, his father hears this, and he goes out to meet him. Okay. However, what happened? He goes with some sort of weapon. Okay. Amarle, and he criticizes him for leaving the Beit Midrash early. He says, "Donatcha niskarta." He said, now you remember your mistress, meaning you're abandoning your prostitute. You're abandoning your studies, which is what you're supposed to be married to right now, and you're going to your mistress. It's not what you're supposed to be doing. This is not your wife, and in a holy relationship, it's like you're cheating on Torah, says the father, which I think here is really the explicit expression of everything we've seen until now on a more implicit level. Some say what he actually said is, you remember now your dove, which is a much more positive language to have used. However, the father is criticizing him for leaving early. I think the fact that it's Erev Yom Kippur again is so powerful. It is, of course, a day of judgment, a day where we really have cheshbon nefesh, where we're deciding what is right and what is wrong. And here, I think the stories are using that as a metaphor of what's really going on here. In the day of judgment, what will you say to yourself was the right thing? To not take a break from studying, to go home and be with my family? Anyway, the two of them were preoccupied fighting in this argument on Erev Yom Kippur, and because of that, they did not manage to have the special meal before Yom Kippur, and it was left as this is the end of the story, that they were preoccupied. This master did not eat. This master did not eat. They did not bring in Yom Kippur properly. To bring in Talmidei Chachamim, bringing in Yom Kippur, fighting a father and son, is a very upsetting image. And so I think that it's not, it's incredibly intentional that this is the ending of our kovetz. This kovetz has all come along to say, leave your wife and your family for such a long time. There's going to be a cost. There's going to be damage done. God forbid someone could die from this, but there can also be other major issues, other major problems. And this is certainly not the Torah ideal. We want you to be passionate about Torah, but we also want you to understand you need to balance that with your relationships, with your wife, with your home, with the world. Just to conclude, we see that there's these running themes throughout kovetz. We have the first two again, with Erev Yom Kippur and Erev Shabbat, the passion for Torah that Rabbi Yehuda has with the pillar of fire going before him. And in the next two, we have the daughter or the wife who has suffered at the hands of the rabbi going away. So the stories are really giving some voice, which we don't always feel when we go through the halachic sections of the Talmud, to what these women have been feeling. Rabbi Hama bar Bisa tries to be more sensitive, and yet he too cannot recognize. He may be able to recognize his house and his wife, but he doesn't know his own son. He expresses regret that he wasn't involved in his son's growing up and becoming a Torah scholar. And then we have Rabbi Akiva, and that is the more positive, perhaps the fantastical, the dream of what could be, and all ends well for Rabbi Akiva, who perhaps is unique in and of himself. And finally, the sort of the end story, which is left so undecided that they're continuing an argument as Yom Kippur comes in, that this is the result of a lack of shalom bayit, that going and learning and not fulfilling shalom bayit and the mitzvah of ona and being mindful of your family relationships, this is the result. And so certainly this aggadah really gives us that sense that the rabbis wanted to convey, that there is more to this halachic discussion than just than just the straight out law. I want to add that just to close, that Talmudic stories and their purpose in the Talmud is something hopefully we'll get to explore more. But just to give you two small quotes, Professor Jeffrey Rubenstein of NYU has written many books. A teacher of mine writes that Talmudic stories engage other dimensions of religious life, such as the development of spiritual sensibility and ethical character. Also, in Sefer HaAggadah, Chaim Nachman Bialik and Ravnitsky write in their introduction that the purpose of the Aggadah is to be a complement to the halacha in the Talmud. And I think we really saw that in this story. They say it's not just another passing literary trend, but the Aggadah is a form of classical literature and is the basis for the spirit of the nation of Israel, and that its fruits have relevance not only in the time of the rabbis, but certainly for all time. I certainly feel that way about this story and hope you will too. Thank you again for learning with me.